our final topic of the day. Google is at war with the Canadian government. Now, in a response to the Liberal government's proposed Online News Act, Bill C-18, Google is temporarily blocking some Canadian users from viewing news content. Now, the bill, it's been passed in the House of Commons and it's soon going to be studied in the Senate. But in its current format, what it says is that current internet giants, so like Google, like Meta, like Facebook, they're going to have to start paying Canadian media companies for making their news content available on these platforms. And if they fail to do that, the companies could get a fine of up to $10 million for their first violation, and it would escalate from there. So what Google has done is they're blocking news content on their Canadian internet service, or they're blocking news content on Canadian Google, at least for now. And they're not doing it to everyone. I think it's 4% of Canadians are experiencing this right now, and they're saying it's a test. The bill isn't in effect right now. The bill isn't a law right now, but Google is testing out to see ways that they can comply with this bill, Bill C-18. And this is one of the ways that they're doing it. They're saying, okay, if we have to pay when we show your news content, how do things look if we just don't show any Canadian news content? So like nothing from CTV or Global or maybe the Toronto Star, but it's interesting times right now in Canada, right? We're not allowed to share Netflix passwords anymore, and now Google is sort of censoring the news that we're getting, right? What are your thoughts on what Google is doing in terms of restricting the news content that we see? And what are your thoughts on Bill C-18 as a whole?
Oh man, this is another interesting and kind of complicated one. I guess my initial question would be, have you experienced this at all? Have you tried to Google something and had all news sources cut out of your Google search yet?
I have not,
Okay.
to my knowledge.
Okay, so I have.
Yeah.
And it is weird. It is weird. Even for this podcast, I was doing some research on my computer and, trying to, get news sources and stuff like that for the information that we were going to talk about. And the Google searches were blank. Usually you're used to, if you search something, you're getting like a dozen pages of relevant search results. I got 2 pages, and that was like 1 page and like 1 extra search and no news sources whatsoever. 0. If you go to the news tab, you're just getting some random stuff from some random blog. And for me, it was also affecting American news as well, not just Canadian news sites.
Really?
So it was very strange. It was like, wow, this has made Google pretty much useless for me at that point. And you can tell that this definitely is going to be a trial, because there's no way that they would do this absolutely, because I would just stop using Google at that point. But the reason why I bring that up is because originally, when I heard this news, to a certain extent, I was for it. I think the idea of, especially nowadays, most news, when it's posted to something like Google or, in the Google news feed, I don't necessarily know about Facebook. Maybe it might be different there, but generally what you're going to get is you're going to get a headline and a small snippet of the news story. And I think the way a lot of people consume news nowadays is you read that headline, you read that small snippet, maybe you just read the headline, and then you're done. You don't really click through that link to actually read the article, see who wrote it, kind of support the news outlet that kind of created that content, so that they can either serve you ads and stuff like that, and kind of make money off of that viewership. But Google makes money off of that viewership, because around that news article, there's also going to be ads and, certain things that they're going to make money off of. So essentially, they're taking content that they're not creating, making money off of it, and not having any of that money trickle down to the actual either publisher or writer that wrote that information. And I think that's kind of an issue, especially as we're going from physical-based, or I shouldn't say going from, we've left physical-based newspapers behind and gone to mainly online news sources. To a certain extent, I agree. I think that there should be some kind of compensation. And there have been other countries that have, made this argument as well. And companies like Google and Meta have kind of complied. So overall, I think there will be some agreement made out if this bill goes through, this Bill C-18 goes through by the Canadian government. I think that Google and Meta and all these other big companies that may be thrown under this umbrella will settle in some way to figure out how they can support and pay for the news that they show on their platform, as opposed to just getting rid of it altogether. Now, that being said, based on my experience of trying to do a Google search and getting no news sources whatsoever, it made me realize a couple of things. One, finding articles. So just to rewind a bit, I used to use a web browser where I'd open it up and it would bring up all my favorite news sites up, and I would just read through them daily. It'd be like, okay, this is the top news stories of this day. Let me read through them. Since then, that was like maybe a decade ago I used to do that. Obviously, nowadays, if you want to learn something, you Google it, you find a news article, you read it, and then you go about your day. Not having access to that made me realize, okay, now I have to start going to the news website, whether it's cnet.com or cbc.com or whatever. And to a certain extent, I like that. I like being forced to go to that website and kind of find out what I need to read. But going to that website made me realize that their search is garbage. And even in a situation like CNET, I went to CNET's website because, like I said, I got no news stories when I Googled information for this podcast. So I went to some of my major sources, Engadget, CNET, and stuff like that. And I noticed that CNET has no search bar anywhere on their main page. And I don't know if this is a bug or if it's just the website's not rendering properly or it's hidden somewhere, but it does not exist. And I was like, this doesn't make any sense. I can't find any information about what I want to look for because there's no way for me to search it. And then, I go to CBC's website and I know there's an article that I specifically have read in the past that I want to bring up again. And I search it and it just doesn't appear. It doesn't come up. So yeah, this is a really weird one of like, I kind of agree with the sentiment, but the rest of the website the rest of the internet has relied on Google for so long that their websites are broken to the point where you can't find any content. And yeah, I think this is a huge issue. And I don't necessarily know what the solution is, but I don't know. From your point of view, do you think that this is something that maybe Google will be forced to kind of just adhere to, or do you think maybe these websites need Google more than Google needs those websites?
So before I answer that, I want to say I've experienced the same thing with search on websites. There are many times where I go to a website that I get a lot of news from or a lot of information. I'm like, all right, I know this article exists, so I'm going to search on your website for it, and it does not return what I was looking like, nothing even relevant to what I searched. And it's like, I know this exists. I read this article like a day ago. Why can't I find it? And then I actually go to Google, type in the article, and then the website. So like if I'm looking for something from The Verge, be like M2 MacBook reviews The Verge in Google, and the exact article will pop up that I'm looking for. And then I go to The Verge's website and I type in that same thing and it doesn't show up. So yeah, to your point, search on websites is completely broken, or at least from most of the websites that I see, apart from Google and YouTube, right? So I don't know, to your question then, I don't think Google will comply. I think that these websites, these news services need Google more than Google needs them. And I want to say especially Canadian ones, right? There's a reason why this is being rolled out in like Canada, and this is being rolled out in, I think, Australia. Tried to do it with Meta and Facebook before. These are relatively small markets compared to the American market. And, we could even look back to, okay, Netflix isn't doing this in America. They're doing it in, I think, like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, smaller markets. When I do research for the podcast, I do Google things, but then I will see the links and I'll click and open them up. Maybe it's because, we're doing research for a podcast, so we actually read beyond just the headlines, right? Because you need a bit more facts, a bit more information. Maybe the typical user or, typical person who uses search will just read the headline, read the first paragraph that answers their question, and then clicks off of it. But, I doing research for this podcast and for videos, I will actually expand the links and I'll go through them. If it wasn't for Google surfacing their links, I probably wouldn't go to CTV, or I might not go to, CBC or any of those, right? It doesn't make sense to me because as I said, when I search something and a Canadian news source pops up, especially when it's something Canadian, I will click on it and then Google directs me to their site, which is good for them. They get paid based off the advertisements they make, right? Which is good because more traffic from Google, more ad sales for you, more money for you. So if you want Google to direct people to your site, which makes you money, and then pay you for directing people to your site, which is even more money. Like that seems a bit greedy to me. That seems a bit like double dipping. Now, yes, Google needs to surface relevant information, but then if they don't surface your information, they're going to give someone else's information. And when I say information, I mean like news stories, right? It's strange that even American ones didn't show up for you. That I find that very strange. Maybe you're getting like an extra special test where you get no news at all. But from my understanding, part of the test is they're getting American coverage of Canadian stories. So then what does that mean for Canadian news in general? If, okay, Google says we're not going to surface, CTV or Global or National Post or any of those, we're just going to give our American news sources. So then it's when I'm looking for information about, something that's happening in Canada, do I get Fox News stories now because Canada insists that Google has to pay CTV, right? So I think that it's I don't think it's good for Canadian news. I don't think it's good for Canadian internet. I don't think it's good for the internet in general, right? I think when this originally came up, we talked about this maybe like a few months ago, right? I didn't agree with it then. I thought it was just benefiting the bigger news sources and the bigger corporations, and it still seems like that to me. I don't know, maybe I'm just partial to Google because that's where I get a lot of information from, Google and YouTube. But yeah, I think that, as you said, we've ditched traditional paper news sources, right? People rarely get newspapers anymore. Everything's digital, especially when you look at how much information you can get through your phone or just, through the internet. So I think that those corporations, those companies are saying, hey, we've lost quite a bit of money because everything has gone digital now. We don't sell we don't sell newspapers anymore. So we have to make back this money somewhere. And instead of, I don't know, maybe develop and search better on their websites, or I don't know, this is just, I think, an easy way for them to try and recoup some of the money that they've lost. But I don't think it benefits us as Canadians, because if they pull this, if they draw this line in the sand and say, okay, Google, you can't use our news sources unless you pay us, then in the end, we lose out as Canadians looking for valid news sources that are at least close to home, as opposed to I'm getting, a news source from Atlanta about what's going on in Ontario. So I'm definitely not for it. I don't think it's a good idea. I think it's greedy from the corporations, to be honest, but maybe I've just bought into the Google propaganda.
Well, I mean, and I think we kind of differ a little bit here, but I think that goes down to, if you're wondering why like this could be, from the corporations, it's because they lobbied for this from the Canadian government. This is something that they're trying to get compensation for because they feel like they're not getting compensation. I think there's two things here, though. One, I do think this is bad for Google as well, because like I said, when it happened to me, it made Google unusable. It's like, well, why would I use Google to search anything if I'm not going to get any relevant information, which is what happened to me. I search for information and I get one page and one extra Google result of things that are completely irrelevant from what I searched. And, Google relies on these news sources for this information. And I think the reason why also US media kind of got stripped out there is because there is also a play from the Canadian government to prioritize Canadian news. So essentially, they don't want exactly what you mentioned, where if you're getting news and you're in Canada or I think Australia does this as well, you're getting American news and that's completely irrelevant to your geographic location. So there has been bills put in place to kind of curb that so that you are actually getting relevant news information for the region that you live in. Now, the problem with that is if you then turn around and say, well, you also can't give Canadian news information without actually paying for it, I think that also now means then you can't give any news information because there's no ratio of Canadian news to non-residential news for the people that you're actually serving that information from. So you're kind of just like, okay, well, we can't give you anything at this point. And I think that's probably what happened to me, where I'm getting no results for my search. Now, that being said, I do think well, I think that affects Google just as much as it affects these news sources. I think it makes Google pretty much unusable. And based on what has happened around the world, like in Australia, I think if this does go through, they will settle. They will find an actual amount that they should be paying these websites for their news sources. And on top of that, I think what should start happening with things like Google News feeds and stuff like that, maybe for specific Canadian and Australian or whatever. I mean, their deal in Australia is different, so I won't even bring them up. But what they might have to start doing in Canada is just giving a headline, essentially. And if you want to learn more information about what that story is about, you actually have to click the link. Because right now, if you're not a part of this program, like me, where you're getting completely restricted from any news information, what will happen is, let's say you're in the Google News feed and you search something, you won't just get the headline, you'll get a synopsis of what that article is about. Essentially meaning that you don't really have to click on that article, especially nowadays. A lot of people get their news just from headlines. If you notice any news aggregate kind of platforms out there, they prioritize headlines over everything because they know generally they're just going to feed you a headline and then you're going to move on to the next story. Or I shouldn't say people will move on to the next story without actually reading that article. That's kind of the new way to consume news. And I guess it was the old way as well. I'm pretty sure the same thing happened with newspapers. But like you go to a little cage and you see a headline and all you see is the headline. You don't see any of the news story whatsoever. You actually have to buy the newspaper to see what it's actually about. So I don't know. It just seems like a weird situation, but to a certain extent, I'm glad this is happening because I think this conversation needs to happen. But I think it also brings up issues, not just from Google side, but also these websites side of we need to fix our search because it's, like you said, it's broken. And things can't go on the way that they're going on right now because there's way too much reliance on Google to actually finding these articles.
Yeah. It brings up a good question and, a good conversation because we're almost rewarded, or it would almost be rewarding these big news corporations for having poorly designed websites.
Yeah.
And be rewarding them for making, very clickbaity headlines and titles, which they've done attention grabbing headlines since they've been around. I mean, that's how you get someone to pick up a newspaper when you're walking past, right? But I think if this goes through, it doesn't really fix the problem. And I doubt that, if, let's say, Google concedes and they say, okay, we're going to give you what you want, we're going to pay you when we surface your information, then it's just going to continue to make clickbaity titles. And then corporations, it's not like they're going to say, okay, we have this extra money, let's really make our search good. So when people come to our websites, they can find exactly what they're looking for. That's not going to happen. It's going to be a bonus in some executive's pocket. And it's not going to make the websites any better, right? Google needs these news corporations, yes, but also these news corporations need Google because they're not doing the groundwork themselves, right? And as you said before, the internet has kind of, they've been propped up on the fact that Google is amazing search. And for a long time, that's all they did. So different news sources, blogs, all that, they didn't have to worry about building search on their own sites because, well, Google is just going to be the search for all of the internet. It's going to direct people to your site. So they cared more about getting themselves, put on the first page of Google, right? They just worried about their SEO. So it's, I think in the end, if both of these parties draw a hard line in the sand, I think as consumers, consumers of the news, we are the ones who are going to lose out. Because if you can't Google something, then you have to go to the website. And if you go to the website and it's either just super clickbaity titles or you're looking for something specific and you can't even find it on search, and it's like, so I just don't get any news then?
Yeah.
Right? So I don't know. You're probably right. They'll probably find some sort of settlement where it's, a middle ground between what both of them are proposing. But it's, I don't know what to say from it aside from I'm not a fan of Bill C-18 just because I think the internet is working pretty good right now, at least in terms of search and finding information. But I guess we'll wait and see if this bill actually gets passed.
Yeah.